Okay, we are recording. Sophia, thank you
Thank
so much for
you.
presenting on protein for us. I'm going to let you take it away.
Will do. Thank you, and thanks for your patience, Bob and Mary, and everyone else watching. And I will share my screen so that everyone can see the presentation I have. Pull this up right here. And we will go play. All right, so today we are going to be talking about protein. In my last presentation, we covered carbohydrates. So I'm kind of going through the macronutrients. And if you were not present at the last presentation or haven't had a chance to watch it yet, the macronutrients are those that we need in our diet in large amounts. And a way to remember that is by that prefix, macro means large. So the macronutrients we think of are protein, carbohydrate, and fat, and also water, technically. Although water, we don't always count as a macronutrient because it doesn't give us any energy, while protein, carbohydrate, and fat do, although it is still a macronutrient. So we'll talk about protein today. Now, what is protein? It is a macronutrient and it is found in muscle, bone, skin, and hair, and most tissues in our body, actually. It is important for metabolic processes, and most commonly we think of growth and development. So any period of growth or any period of formation, even at the cellular level, requires proteins. And because of that, proteins are often considered the building blocks of life because they are necessary and essential for that growth and development. Any structural change they are required for. Now, if we think more closely about protein functions within growth and development, we often think about how the formation or making of new cells requires proteins, but it's also important in cell repair. So anytime there is damage or trauma to the body, or if something doesn't form correctly, proteins come in there to play a role in the repair of those cells and of those larger structures as well. And we think of growth and development specifically in children and teens and pregnancy, but it's really in our entire lives. Anytime we are building or growing, repairing, all of that has protein involved. And while we think about protein as the building block of life, there are building blocks of protein. So in my last presentation on carbohydrates, we can kind of compare this and think about how with a carbohydrate chain or a starch or a large sugar molecule, the building blocks of that carbohydrate was glucose. So glucose is that simplest form of carbohydrate. For protein, the simplest form of that chain, or whatever, however big or small that protein is an amino acid. And there are 20 amino acids that make up the proteins in our body. And those amino acids join together and they form larger chains of proteins called peptides, and then they can form polypeptides. So the bigger and bigger it gets, the more names there are for it. And those proteins continue to build and join together to form the muscles and all of the various tissues in our body. Of those amino acids, there are 9 that are considered essential. And what essential means is not that it's essential to our body, although it is, but it means it must come from food. So in order to get those essential amino acids that are a part of our growth and development, we have to consume it in our diet. The non-essential amino acids, and there are about 11 of those are ones that we can get through the diet, but if we don't, it's not the end of the world. Our body can actually make those or pull them from other resources and form them on its own. So the essential amino acids, our body is not able to do that. That's why we have to get it through our diet. The non-essential amino acids, our body can pull those from other places and come up with them. There are also conditional essential amino acids or conditionally essential amino acids. And those are amino acids that in times of, status quo, they would not be considered essential, but in times of stress or illness or hypermetabolism, so if our metabolic rate is even higher, even if we're exercising, could be an example, those then become essential. So then we would have to get those through food. We do have protein sources, and if we think of those, they generally are in two different categories, animal and plant. So animal sources are going to be the things that we think of as protein foods, such as meats, milk, fish, and eggs. And also plant sources, which would be plant-based protein foods, such as soy, beans, legumes, nuts and nut butters, and even grains can contribute a good amount of protein. The ones that I have listed here are considered a higher protein grain, such as wheat germ and quinoa. And with grains, what we typically see is the whole grain or whole wheat. If we think of breads, a whole grain or whole wheat bread, that will have more protein than a refined white bread. And that's because of the processing. When you process a whole wheat or a whole grain, you remove parts of the seed. You'll also remove the part that provides that protein, which is the germ. And you also would lose some of the fiber. So the less processed and the more whole grain or whole wheat grains you're consuming, you'll get more of a protein in that source. So here is myth or fact. Myth or fact, you do not need to eat animal products to get all of the protein you need in your diet. What do we think?
Fact. Fact.
That's correct. It's true. So while many animal sources contain all 9 essential amino acids in one serving, I guess you would say, as well as the non-essential amino acids, some plant sources also contain those. Oftentimes we hear that plant protein is not as good as animal protein, but you really are still able to get the essential amino acids that you need through plant sources. Sometimes it requires you to combine plant sources. So to eat more than one plant protein in order to get all of those amino acids that you need. And one example that I always think of is rice and beans. Rice and beans together form a complete protein. So if you ate beans or if you ate rice, you might not get all of the essential amino acids that you need, but by eating them together, that makes it a complete protein and you would be able to get all essential amino acids. So how much protein do we actually need? And once again, it really depends on your personal energy needs. This differs from individual to individual, although we can generalize. The recommendations say that you should generally have 10 to 35% of your total calories be from protein. And 10 to 35% is a big range. So if you were to calculate the gram per kilogram of body weight, the range is from anywhere from 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, even up to 2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. So it can be a huge range of protein. 1 ounce, which is about 30 grams, of most protein-rich foods contain 7 grams of protein. And if we put that into perspective, 1 ounce of meat, which is oftentimes a slice of deli meat or a slice of cheese, that would give you about 7 grams of protein. So even in that 1 ounce, you get a good amount of protein. We also think of 1 large egg that provides about 7 grams of protein. And for plant-based sources, a 1/4 cup of tofu or a 1/2 cup of cooked beans or lentils. So you really don't need to consume a whole lot of that protein food to get a good amount of protein. Oftentimes our standard portion is about 3 or 4 ounces. If we think of like a chicken breast or a fish fillet, that's usually around 3 or 4 ounces. So even in that, you would get about 21 to 28 grams of protein, which is a good amount of protein. Other sources include low-fat dairy, and any dairy really, whole grains, as I mentioned before, which would have more than white or refined grain products, turkey or chicken, and skinless, you would be removing any of the excess fat if that's desired. Lean cuts of beef or pork, which include the round, top sirloin, or tenderloin, and removing the visible fat in order for you to really treat it as just the protein. Fish or shellfish, which are naturally lean sources of protein, and any sort of beans or lentils. So I listed a bunch out here: pinto, black beans, kidney beans, lentils, split peas, garbanzo beans. But really, the whole plethora of beans and lentils are a great source of plant-based protein. Nuts and seeds, and again, these are just a few examples: almonds, hazelnuts, mixed nuts, peanuts, peanut butter, sunflower seeds, or walnuts. And then, of course, the protein products from soy, tofu, tempeh, and other packaged or prepared soy protein products. Now, going back to a complete protein, again, that means that it contains the 20 plus amino acids, including those 9 essential amino acids to make new protein in the body. An incomplete protein indicates it lacks 1 or more of those 9 essential amino acids. And again, you can combine incomplete proteins to together consume a complete protein. That would still be appropriate, and your body would treat it the same way. Essential amino acids mean we must get them through the diet. And while animal-based foods tend to be a good source of complete protein, plant-based foods often lack 1 or more essential amino acids, but not always. And again, we can consume more than 1 plant-based food together in order to make that a complete protein. So those who do not eat animal protein can eat a variety of protein-containing plant foods and still get all essential amino acids. Some complete plant protein sources include chia seeds, quinoa, and soy. Can we lack protein? We can, although in the US, we generally consume more than enough daily protein. Oftentimes there's a concern about getting your protein in, making sure you have enough throughout the day. It's been popularized, especially in the fitness industry with weightlifting. And although those athletes do require more protein, in general, we consume more than enough already. Worldwide, many people suffer from food insecurity, and protein deficiency and malnutrition is prevalent in those areas because of that. In the US, more often than not, food insecurity is not as big of an issue. And so we are able to consume enough protein even without trying to incorporate more. So just with our diet as it stands, we generally get enough. And one thing that I found when I was preparing this presentation is the idea of protein packages. And that is to say, when you're eating a protein-containing food, it's important to consider what else is a part of that protein-containing food, whether it's fat, fiber, sodium, other additives, other carbohydrates, other sources of nutrition or sources of non-nutrition. We don't always just eat, meat straight from the animal with minimal processing. Oftentimes it is processed, whether it's with salts added for preservation, whether it's breaded and cooked. All of those things we need to consider if we're eating, a steak straight from the grocery store with no preparation, or we're eating a country fried steak. So there's differences in those. Although they both would be considered protein foods, their packages are quite different. And I want to segue into the different disease states that are oftentimes related to protein, and specifically red meat. And much of that is because of these protein packages. with red meat, we find that there are higher amounts of saturated fat and cholesterol, and that's true for all animal products compared to a plant-based food. Animal products have saturated fat and cholesterol naturally, whereas plant-based foods or proteins do not, unless it's added. So what research has found is that eating small amounts of red meat, especially processed, can be linked to higher risk of heart disease and stroke. So it's recommended that replacing red and processed meat with healthy protein sources, such as plant-based protein sources, or lean proteins, such as chicken or poultry or fish, seems to reduce these risks. And the reasoning for that seems to be that plant-based protein sources, as I mentioned, are more unsaturated, meaning they don't have that saturated fat that animal products have. They have more unsaturated fats. And the unsaturated fats lowers LDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol is linked to heart disease. Because plant sources don't contain cholesterol naturally, if we are to reduce the amount of red meat we consume and put more plant-based sources in there, we are removing the saturated fat and also inserting the healthy unsaturated fat. So that whole process of removing some of the things that are linked to higher risk of heart disease, as well as incorporating some of the things that are considered protective against heart disease, seems to be the recommendations. As far as diabetes, this is another example where the source of the protein rather than the amount or the quantity seems to be related to disease incidence. And the source of the protein, in that sense, we're talking about that protein package once again. So with red meat, once more, what was found is that eating more red meat predicts higher risk of type 2 diabetes, while consuming nuts, legumes, and poultry is related to lower risk. This could be related to the cooking or preparation method. For example, if you had red meat or really any sort of meat that was breaded and fried, that could contribute to a higher risk of diabetes. But also considering if we're, instead of consuming the red meat, incorporating more plant-based foods like the nuts and legumes, perhaps that is what is lowering our risk for diabetes. So again, you have to consider both sides. For cancer, this is one that has been researched related to kind of the smoke and the char. If we think about a barbecue, high temperature grilling creates potentially cancer-causing compounds in meat, including polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines. And this is more, at least what I found, has been researched based on the correlation between. It's hard to say the finite causation, although this references the cancer-causing compounds. Generally, it's recommended to not consume those food items that have significant char or smoke on them because of that, although to what degree or extent that consumption may be linked to cancer is not spelled out clearly. As far as weight control goes, researchers at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health followed the diet and lifestyle habits of over 120,000 men and women for up to 20 years. And what they found was that those who ate more red and processed meat over the course of the study gained more weight, while those who ate more nuts over the course of the study gained less weight, about 0.5 pound less every 4 years. And again, I think about this is not only about saying we should eat less red meat and incorporate more plant-based foods. I think it is more about the incorporation of foods. This is still presenting the fact that these participants gained weight, they just gained less weight. So we need to be paying attention to those details. And I don't think that the takeaway I'm trying to present here is that we shouldn't eat any red or processed meat. I think it's about reducing that amount because of the research that has linked it to various chronic diseases. But I don't think we can say consume no red meat ever. I think the research is presenting those who ate more or less, this is what they're finding. The benefit of incorporating more plant-based foods is there because of the difference in saturated versus unsaturated fat intake and how the unsaturated fat can be protective. A few other interesting notes on protein relates to food allergies. So it's actually specific proteins that are involved in food allergies. If we think about celiac disease, it's the gluten protein that once consumed causes an overreaction of that individual's immune system, which is really interesting. Similarly, those other big food allergies that are present in our society, such as eggs, fish, milks, peanuts, tree nuts, and soybeans, cause allergic reactions in some people based on the protein involved there. Certain diseases are recommended to monitor their protein intake, and oftentimes it is limited depending on the disease state. But we think of often those with kidney disease have to limit their protein intake unless they are receiving hemodialysis, in which case their needs are increased. And liver disease is another instance where monitoring protein intake is important. And one other thing that I don't touch on too often here, but I do think is important, is thinking about the protein sources in our society as well as in our personal diets. Where those come from has a great impact on the environment. So whether we are consuming animal protein sources, the farm, or the plant where all of that is processed, that has a big impact on our environment. Similarly, if we're consuming veggies, all of those have an impact on our environment. So being mindful about that can influence a lot of people on what they choose as their protein source, what sort of protein they consume, if it's organic or if it's from a small farm itself. A lot of those influence our food choices culturally as well as in society. So a few key takeaways. Again, I don't want this presentation to say, don't consume any red or processed meat ever. That's not the point here. What I want to do here is present what that research is saying at this point and encourage us all to get protein from plants when possible because of the benefits. So because plant-based proteins do provide us with more of those unsaturated healthy fats and less of the saturated fats, they're a good thing to incorporate. And be selective with animal sources. If you are consuming animal proteins, try and consume less processed ones. Specifically, I think of those where we have a lot of things that are added to it. So for a lot of ham products or lunch meats, a lot of sodium is added to that. For a lot of other processed foods, whether it's in a stew or if we buy frozen breaded chicken wings, all of that processing adds a lot more. And of course, if it's a convenience or a cost thing, then I would always say it's better to get your protein in the way that you can and be mindful about that. But try to choose unprocessed when possible and when feasible. And I have some references there. And that was it. Short and sweet today.
Sophia, I'd like to go back to the conditional amino acids.
Yes.
And you mentioned if you exercise, these would maybe be more important to be sure you get. And what foods would you be consuming to get those conditional amino acids?
So let's see. I have listed here the conditional amino acids include arginine, cysteine, glutamine, tyrosine, glycine, ornithine, proline, and serine. And what this says here is that it's more times illness and stress as opposed to what I think of as metabolic stress that relates to exercise than a general exercise that you would need to consume these. So I think it's more so
like weightlifting.
Yeah. And that's when one popular supplement that I can think of is, I think it's branched chain amino acids. That's a popular supplement that a lot of weightlifters will take before their workout, because it's this idea that consuming those right before the workout can boost your protein catabolism, which is rebuilding the proteins. But that's not really necessary. If we're consuming the protein in our diet, that's adequate. So it's kind of along the lines of various misperceptions, I think, in the fitness industry, that we need excessive amounts of protein when we really don't need that much. And we don't necessarily need to supplement more than what we're getting in our meals throughout the day, meals and snacks.
Okay.
Sophia?
Yes.
In the later years of life, when there's just with normal aging, there's increased cell death and a lot of cell repair going on. Do the protein needs increase significantly over than what they would in the middle years when you're sort of steady?
Interestingly enough, it's lower as we age.
It is lower.
For normal, healthy, older adults without considerable chronic disease, if we think about just the average older adult, the protein needs are about 1 gram per kilogram. So it's really not a lot.
Yeah.
It's highest we see for people who are in states of metabolic stress. And that would be like if they are malnourished, or if they've had significant weight loss and they need to replenish that weight, or if they've had trauma or injury, like a fracture. Their overall energy needs are higher and their protein needs are also higher.
Okay. Also, do you know whether the meat substitute products like the Impossible Burger, do the plant sources in those provide all the amino acids, or are they more just like plants that maybe some and not all?
That's a good question. I would have to look at the ingredients, but I imagine they have a good combination of plant-based proteins to make that burger. I'm not positive that it's a complete protein, but I imagine it has a lot of different plant proteins in it that would come together and provide most essential amino acids. But let me see if I can see what the ingredients are. So I see water soy protein concentrate. So if that is all of the soy protein, that would be a complete protein.
Right.
I also see 2% or less of potato protein. So that would contribute a little bit. I don't think that would be a complete protein. Soy protein isolate and some other things in there. So if it is, you know, the soy protein in its essence, then that would be a complete protein.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I didn't realize that quinoa was a complete protein.
Yeah.
So I now understand why it is served fairly often.
Yes.
Okay. And I am trying to learn to like it.
Yeah, it's, on its own, it can be, I think, quite flavorless. it's kind of like rice, you know, it doesn't really have much to it. And so I think adding it to salads or incorporating it into a bean bowl, something like that to have some flavor with it, I think helps.
Well, and it also helps when it's used as the side starch, if vegetables are mixed in with it too.
Yeah,
that really enhances it.
Yeah, I'm a proponent of it being a starch because I think there are a lot of benefits from it as a starch side. We're still getting some protein, we're getting some fiber, so I like it in there.
Okay.
Well, wonderful job, Sophia.
Thank you.
Hello, viewers of the future. I know people catch up on it later, so thank you for the presentation. Bob and Mary, as our residents, do you have anything else you'd like to ask? I'm still recording because I noticed that the questions were beneficial and not of a super personal nature.
No, that's okay.
I just wanted to ask Sophia, and this is not necessarily related to protein information, but are you a fan of, what is that? The People's Pharmacy column in the Sunday paper where they propose natural methods for treating various ailments. The most recent one was grape juice and Certo for arthritis pain. I just wondered, I'm curious if you ever look at that or.
I have not, but now I'm intrigued and I am going to go check it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they offer a lot of, what would you call it, Bob?
Like naturopathic.
Natural remedies. And
I think there's, in nutrition, there's a lot of overlap with these herbal remedies that I think can be beneficial, but can also be dangerous to an extent because some of those do have interactions with various medications. Right. So that's why it's one of the things that we like to be informed of is, if any resident admitted to a hospital or to the health center, if we're assessing their medications and any kind of supplements that they take personally at home, we want to make sure there's no interactions. I think that's not always considered when those recommendations come out because it's just saying, oh, here's a great benefit for you. But something that we always should be mindful of is any supplements can have a potential interaction with any medications.
Well, one thing about this column is often people will write in and they're having problems with a medication that's been prescribed. Mm-hmm. And then the alternate is offered for that.
Yeah.
But we read it faithfully. Have we ever tried anything?
Actually, the two people who write this specific column are pharmacy school faculty.
Well, that's good.
So they do have a background.
That's good.
I myself sometimes think they go a little overboard in their support of some of the unproven remedies, but they do have some credentials. So.
Yeah. And again, I always think with any kind of recommendation is that it's important to look at the research, and if they are presenting research that's backing that, then that helps. But I also think it's important, if you as an individual are considering trying something, definitely talk to your primary care physician beforehand, just to make sure and see, if they think of anything that could be potentially harmful, we want to rule that out.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
We really enjoy it.
Thank you for attending. I appreciate it so much.
We still cook.
So. Good. Great.
But
have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Al.